Welcome back, everyone. This is Treks to Nowhere. Well, we've reached the point in this podcast, now 40 episodes in, where I'd finally like to share with you all a very special Trek to Nowhere, the story of my 2012 Barkley Marathons run. At the time I was preparing for and ultimately running this epic race, it became completely all-consuming for me. And in the decades since, I've come to realize that my experience at the 2012 Barkley Marathons has absolutely changed me, and has therefore become one of the most transformative experiences of my entire life. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Barkley Marathons and have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll start by saying this. There have been several recent documentary films made about the race, including the one that was filmed the year that I ran. If you have seen the film, The Race That Eats Its Young, well, then you've seen me. I'm featured in that documentary as the third and final finisher of the race. Spoiler alert, I did finish the race. If you still have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll give you my quick 2-cent summary of the event. The Barkley Marathons is a 100-plus mile foot race that takes place in early spring in the Tennessee mountains of Frozen Head State Park, not far from the town of Oak Ridge. The race has been run for nearly 40 years now and is most well known for just how ridiculously difficult and unforgiving it is. In the nearly 40 years that the race has existed, there have only been 20 unique finishers of the full 100-plus mile distance, and that's if you include this year's 3 unique finishers. Also, in those nearly 40 years, there had never been a woman finisher, until this year when Jasmine Paris out of the UK was the first woman to complete the course within the time limit. Now, speaking of the course and time limits, the race is made up of 5 grueling loops, each about 25 miles in length, which must all be completed in under 60 hours total. 60 hours may sound reasonably doable on paper, but most of the course is off-trail through difficult terrain made up of incredibly steep climbs and littered with obstacles like razor-sharp briars and brambles. In total, the course presents over 60,000 feet of elevation gain and multiple sections that must be navigated via map and compass. Lastly, nothing about this race is typical. The start time can be at any point within a 12-hour window and is only announced 1 hour before the actual start itself. GPS and altimeter technology are both prohibited on the course, and there are no aid stations. Runners must carry all necessary food and supplies for each loop and can only resupply between loops at the primary starting area. Given the time limit and necessity to keep moving at all times, there is generally no time for any sleep as well in the 60 hours of the race, meaning that most runners are wildly sleep deprived by the time they reach the 4th loop, if they reach the 4th loop. Now, there is quite a storied history with the creation of this event involving James Earl Ray and a famous prison escape, but for those details, I'll defer you all to the multiple documentaries, as they do a much better job of telling those tales than I would. As for me, I will share with you all my story and experience from the 2012 Barkley Marathons over the next 3 episodes. And rather than follow a strictly chronological approach here, I've decided to tell my story a bit out of order, so to speak, and instead start with the moments, hours, and days immediately following my 2012 run and finish. And again, spoiler alert, I did finish the race, all 5 loops under the 60-hour time limit, and became the 12th unique finisher at that time. In the second episode, I'll walk you all through the training and lead up to the event, and then we'll finish up the story in the third episode with a recap of everything that went down during the race and my time out there. It is important to note here that while my full race report for this event is public and online for everyone to read, I plan to share new details in this 3-part series that I've never shared before. And lastly, I would like to share with you all that I've been hard at work at writing an entire collection, a book, I suppose, on my Barkley experience through the years. The first part of my story that I will share in this episode, which I've titled The Aftermath, is the first chapter of this written collection. I hope to finish the entire collection by the end of this year, 2024. So, with all of that out of the way, it's time to dive into the story, starting with this first of 3 episodes. The Aftermath. From the very moment I touched the yellow gate at the end of my 5th and final loop at the 2012 Barkley Marathons, the questions and comments began flooding in. And while the majority of those enthusiastic and spirited comments were overwhelmingly positive, there was certainly a non-trivial portion that had a distinctly different tone. John is a decent runner and all, but hardly elite. How did he pull this off? It's a good thing that the weather was perfect and that the course was easier this year, otherwise John would have never finished. On paper, there's no way someone like John should have finished the Barkley. I feel like there's more to this story. John must have latched on to some really good veterans to help him navigate and to pull him around the course. I just can't fathom how someone with such a mediocre resume could pull this off. What was John's secret? He must have had one to finish the Barkley. Clearly, John got super lucky. I doubt he'd ever be able to finish again. While most of these comments likely weren't meant to be overtly accusatory or disparaging, they were still incredibly biting. In less than 1 day, I went from a feeling of pure joy, bliss, and accomplishment to one of self-doubt and self-defense. It is easy to believe that these less than flattering comments can and should be brushed off or ignored, but like the countless briar scratches and rat bites that I had incurred during the race, they lingered and stung. When I woke up in my Oak Ridge motel room the day after my finish, I barely had the energy or stamina to crawl to the restroom. Yet my first and most poignant memory of that morning is of perusing through the countless emails that were casting doubts on my performance and race result. I had even received emails from friends letting me know that people were talking and had considerable questions about my finish. People were apparently playing out hypothetical scenarios of how one might cut the course short if they were clever enough. I still remember recounting all of my book pages in the hotel room several times just to make sure that I had actually collected them all. So in short, rather than relishing my momentary triumph and absorbing the many congratulatory emails from friends and family, I instead spent that entire day in that hotel room festering in a puddle of self-doubt and disbelief. In the months leading up to my Barkley Marathons run, I had spent 12 long weeks in Antarctica over the 2011-12 austral summer season, with not much else to think about other than the Barkley. I thought a lot about just why it was that I was going to apply and what I hoped to learn by running if my application were accepted. Of course, I knew that my odds of acceptance were slim, but I needed to be absolutely sure of my motivations given the commitment that such an event would demand. What I concluded was that unlike any of my other runs, if invited to participate in this specific odyssey, it would be one entirely of self-discovery. Therefore, I decided that regardless of what might transpire, this would be an inward exploration. I ultimately told no one of my eventual entry other than my partner and a few select Barkley alumni such as Ed Furtaw and Alan Abbs. In addition, I decided not to share the details of my training or log any of the particulars of my workouts for fear that someone might quickly figure out what I was up to. For years, I had been keeping a rather detailed web journal of all of my running exploits, but in late January of 2012, I cryptically wrote, quote, I've shared a lot of what some may consider personal information on this site. I have posted about every race that I'm either scheduled to run or contemplating for 2012. However, this one time, I've decided to hold off on detailing a specific event that I've been selected to run this year. There's a part of me that wants to shout to the world about it, and frankly, I'm still shocked that I was even invited. But this one event shall remain anonymous, however, at least until after it's over. So why not talk about it? Well, quite simply, I will only say that this particular challenge is completely and entirely a personal one. This is something that I want to do and I'm going to do as a test and challenge for myself and myself alone. This will be one of the most difficult and humbling endeavors I have ever attempted, and many battles will likely be fought along the way. End quote. And that was how I left it. I did go on to post a few minor specifics about some of my subsequent workouts and training blocks once I learned of my acceptance, but I kept it vague enough so as not to give away any concrete ideas of what I had coming up. In addition, for every workout that I publicly posted about, there were usually over a dozen that I didn't. My goal was to show up to Frozen Head State Park as a completely unknown and anonymous runner. I didn't want a noteworthy resume and definitely did not want there to be any expectations regarding my run and overall performance. I wanted to be essentially invisible throughout the entirety of the event. Even before arriving in the park, I had also decided that I would mostly keep to myself and wouldn't really be outwardly engaging with any of the other runners. This wasn't because of any inherent introverted discomfort or to snub other competitors. It was entirely due to my desire to remain in the periphery and in my own head. There were various documentary film crew members and photographers at the event that year, and I did my best to avoid their presence in any one-on-one interviews. I was eventually persuaded into providing a few short clips, but I kept my answers mostly generic or vanilla. Throughout the event, my plan was to hide in plain sight, as an extra in the scene, so to speak, and to simply be forgettable. While this approach of anonymity seemed ideal on paper, it had the unfortunate side effect of working a bit too well. As I mostly kept to myself and didn't reveal any of my training or preparation, many looked at my eventual finish as some sort of bizarre fluke, a result of mostly circumstantial luck or even fraudulence, and not of any sort of purposeful or rigorous training and preparation. My fellow competitors and the countless spectators on site and online had no idea just how much ceaseless and surgical planning, conditioning, and research I had carried out before the lighting of that proverbial cigarette. It is very easy to find oneself speaking in superlatives when referencing the Barkley Marathons, but there is absolutely no question that I trained harder and more ferociously for that event than for anything else I have ever done. I can remember telling one other runner in Frozen Head in the days leading up to the run that I didn't even study for my doctoral candidacy exam as much as I did for Barkley. Now, incidentally, since participating in the 2012 Barkley Marathons, there has now been one event for which I did arguably train harder. That event was the 2013 Barkley Marathons run. Looking back now, I can at least understand the doubts and questions immediately following my finish. Mere mortals are not meant to finish the Barkley. Every previous finisher of the race has had an adventure resume far superior to my own and with accomplishments far outweighing mine. During my preparation for the 2012 event, I recall reading up on the sole 2011 finisher, Brett Mowney, and learning of his recently set FKT on the John Muir Trail. When he set that record, many also doubted his achievement. He was ostensibly a no one in the ultra-running community. He had no resume or pedigree, and therefore hadn't established himself as an elite. One posted comment on the FKT Pro boards from 2010 notes, quote, Brett's reported record-breaking time on the JMT is so amazing that he must indeed be Jesus. I've waited 6 months for someone else to speak up, but no one has, so I guess I'm the one to act as Brett's Thomas. I'm not necessarily calling this all a hoax, but I need more proof. End quote. It was only when Brett went on to finish the Barkley 1 year later that people truly began to accept his skill as an athlete and his FKT claim on the John Muir Trail. A post on that same FKT Pro board from April of 2011, just a few days after Brett became the 10th Barkley finisher, reads, quote, I think Brett just answered the question about whether he was capable of his JMT record. He just became one of only 10 people to ever finish the Barkley Marathons. Well done. End quote. So, given my somewhat introverted and self-reflective approach to my 2012 Barkley Marathons run, it did therefore have the unfortunate side effect of keeping the world in the dark with respect to my preparations. Again, it's easy to speak hyperbolically with respect to the Barkley, but it was not an exaggeration when I told my fellow competitors and the documentary crew that I had done nothing but eat, sleep, and breathe the Barkley in the 4 months leading up to the race. And despite my aversion to the documentary crew that was filming during the 2012 event, in many ways I'm now glad that they were there. Because of their footage, there is at least partial evidence of my run. There exist captured snippets of my time out on that course that will forever live on and reveal to the world both the sheer horror that I endured and my utter exhaustion and delirium at the finish. Of course, even with this footage forever locked away in the annals of Barkley lore and history, there was still over 90% of my run that transpired while I was entirely alone and fighting off constant temptations to quit and a ceaseless feeling of fatigue and despair. 60 hours alone with one's thoughts while moving through the Barkley Marathons course is a state of existence that is simply indescribable and one steeped in anguish. For many days following my finish, I tried to put the web of negative thoughts out of my mind. I had to constantly remind myself that only days prior I had driven down to Tennessee with the intent on being a nobody and testing myself on my own. In both regards, I had been successful until the moment that I touched that final yellow gate, and I had become somebody. From that moment, countless unknown and faceless souls were now discussing and debating my run within the ethers of the internet. When I did eventually make it home to my small apartment in central Pennsylvania, I slowly began the process of organizing my thoughts and memories from my time at Frozen Head. I knew that if I waited too long, many of the important details and special moments I experienced during my run might become lost forever. I was also saddled with a desperate need to detail my experience so that I might better substantiate my performance and hopefully extinguish the doubts that were already growing and festering. The imposter syndrome had become a looming monster. The numerous emails I had received, both directly and indirectly through the relevant listserv groups, had already become overwhelming. I couldn't keep up. And rather than trying to respond to them all, I concluded that my time would best be spent writing up a detailed race report. This way, I could just publish that record to the world, and people could sort out the details for themselves. Of course, I knew this meant it needed to be airtight, leaving no room for interpretation. It would have to be as detailed and specific as possible. Of course, I had written countless run and race reports before, but never with this sort of urgency. I really wanted to tell my complete, unabridged story as soon as possible, if only so I could put it behind me. During this short window of time, I was also falling incredibly far behind on my graduate school deliverables. My advisor, while supportive and tolerant of my various exploratory adventures and sojourns, was still eager to get progress updates regarding my research. And on top of this looming well of anxiety, I was also contending with a level of fatigue and brain fog that was heretofore unknown to me. Both of my feet were also entirely macerated and numb from the torture they had just endured, and I could barely walk. Even my Appalachian Trail thru hike had been kinder on my feet than Barkley. In simplest terms, I was an absolute mess and in no condition to be organizing any sort of cogent thoughts or profundities regarding my time out there. So instead, I just scribbled down some bullet points along with any individual memories that I didn't want to have slip away and that I could still recall, and planned to just organize things later. And then I slept. A lot. Several days passed by in a vague and phantom-like fog, and I only lumbered out of bed a few times to eat and use the restroom. The emails and phone calls continued to pile up, and it ultimately took me 3 days to recover enough to regain an adequate level of cognition. I often think back to that window of time and realize that I have very little memory of the actual drive home from Tennessee, and only faint glimpses of those 3 days recovering alone in my apartment. During this temporary isolation from society, I also started to accrue several requests for interviews and podcast appearances. People were eager to talk to me, usually out of some kind of morbid and twisted curiosity. Often, though, they just wanted to learn my secrets and disentangle my larger story or just hear from that Barkley mid-packer. And admittedly, there was a part of me that was eager to tell my story and clear up the matter, but I also was frustrated that I'd likely be defending myself and providing my proof to the doubters. I just kept telling myself to focus on the race report first so that I could openly invite people into the full backstory. People would learn that I really did put in all of the work prior to my race, and that there wasn't any sort of disingenuous or sinister revelation to unravel or discover. I trained really hard, studied really hard, and went to Frozen Head singular in purpose. It really was just that simple and, frankly, unsexy. One of the very first things that I posted publicly once I awoke from my extended stupor was a single photograph that I had taken on the floor of my apartment. This photo featured a layout of all 55 of my collected book pages from my run. And while I was proud of this collection, I suppose part of me was motivated to post this picture as just a way to quickly prove my achievement before writing up my full run report. Throwing some chum to the sharks, as it were. But even with this photo published, I still felt like it wasn't enough. I can remember while laying out the pages for the photo that 2 had become stuck together, and I thought that I had somehow missed a page during one of my loops. I obviously hadn't, as Laz had counted and scrutinized every one of my pages following each loop, but this is how unsure I had become of everything. On one morning, about a week after returning home, and after my life had started to return to the rather mundane existence of a fourth-year graduate student, I woke up from a deep sleep convinced that it had all been a dream, and that I never wrote an entrance essay, never drove to Tennessee, and never actually participated in the Barkley Marathons at all. In my twisted mind, this somehow seemed more believable than actually having completed all 5 loops successfully. I had somehow become so swallowed by the doubts and uncertainty that I became convinced that it was all a figment of my imagination. I was never at Frozen Head, and I never finished the Barkley Marathons. Before responding to a single email or following up with a single interview request, I had already drafted an entire entrance essay for the 2013 race a year later. I was in such disbelief that the only way I felt I could convince myself that I did and could finish the Barkley Marathons was to complete it the following year. I came to this entire conclusion just days after returning from my 2012 run. This is the level of mental self-doubt that I found myself in those early days. The following is an excerpt from that 2013 essay, which I wrote just days after returning from my finish. Laz, I have thought a lot about what I might say to you if I were to submit another application to the Barkley Marathons. In all that time of thinking, I never did come up with any sort of array of profundities or overly inspirational motifs to spill into this email. The honest truth as to why I should be allowed to run again in 2013 is not what you might think. It's not because I feel that I deserve to or because I somehow am worthy or I earned it. Frankly, I don't think anyone truly ever earns it. The reason I'm sending this application in is because I am haunted. I am haunted by disbelief. Every single moment since I left Frozen Head State Park on April 2nd, I think about what happened and my experience participating in the Barkley Marathons. But every minute that passes, the less I actually believe it really did happen. I think back to specific memories I have of being lost on the course, getting water from a creek, picking ticks off of myself, or laughing alongside other runners, and I start to wonder if it wasn't all just a dream. I look at results listings and postings on the internet that clearly show my name, but somehow I no longer believe it. I email Ed Furtaw and ask him, did I really finish? Was I really there? He assures me that I did and that I was. I see pictures of myself at the finish line touching the yellow gate, and it simply feels wrong. It must be a picture of someone else or doctored somehow. This has all been eating me up. I have seen so many people online say things like I shouldn't have finished and that I'm not an elite runner or that I just got really lucky, and I have started to believe them. But then I think about how damn hard I trained. I think about how many god-awful hill repeats I did over and over and over and over again. How I spent 15 hours every weekend training on hills and trails. How I did 2-a-day workouts during the week, every week of more hills, and how I studied that damn Frozen Head map for months. I think about how I sat every night at the dinner table down at my remote field camp in Antarctica while others were playing cribbage or poker, and I studied race reports and scribbled down notes and compass bearings. I tell myself that I did finish, damn it, and it was because I trained hard enough and that I wanted it badly enough. But then I wake up the next day and I don't believe it again. So back to the question at hand. I should be allowed to run the Barkley in 2013 because quite simply, I need to experience it again and know that it is real. I need its very presence to course through my veins. I need to stand in the park and take it in again during the race so that I can truly remember and be a part of it. I want to perhaps prove to myself once and for all that it did really happen and that I am really a finisher. Well, either that or I'll crawl back to camp whimpering like a baby after one loop and realize that it was in fact all just a dream, and a very bad one at that. Signed, John. Photographs and video snippets from the 2012 race began making their way into my inbox. I would open attachments and clearly see myself on the course, yet I somehow still didn't believe them. Photoshop manipulations, I concluded. I would watch video clips that ostensibly showed me running up to the gate or speaking with fellow competitors. All fabricated or artificially generated, I surmised. I became absolutely convinced that I was never there, despite all of the messages and seemingly incontrovertible proof that had found its way to me. I decided that my only option was to go again in 2013 and complete all 5 loops. Maybe then I might actually believe it all. Never in all of my life had I so entirely doubted a real and genuinely experienced life event. Perhaps the intense physical stress of all of my training combined with the mental strain of my graduate studies had triggered a full-on psychological breakdown. Even today, I still can't explain this dissociation. But eventually, images started slowly finding their way back into my mind. I would see a very specific log lying across a leaf covered section of trail. Every tiny detail would be as clear as day, and I would remember the smells of the forest. I would immediately know with certainty that this was in fact a real place that I had seen and experienced during my run. I would see flashes of specific boulders, the exact recess that a book was tucked into, or that one apple tree by the trail junction, and remember that they were all real places. I would remember that fleeting moment of time when I crossed paths with Jared Campbell on our fifth loop, when he asked me if I too was on my final loop. Memories of the agonizing pain I experienced in my feet would regularly come back, and I would often recall the precise moment that I nearly quit at the end of my fourth loop. A vivid image popped into my mind of pulling a small card out of my running pack while on that fourth loop, scribbled with words of encouragement written by my partner. It was that card that ultimately gave me the strength to keep going and complete that fourth loop. Surely, if this card were real and actually existed, then it had to be a genuine memory, right? On the floor in the corner of my apartment was a heaping pile of running equipment and supplies from my seemingly real trek down to Frozen Head. I still hadn't unpacked over a week later, or perhaps I never actually went at all. I remember spending over 30 minutes tearing apart that pile, desperately searching for that small card, thinking that given its sentimental value, it would absolutely prove that my memories were not somehow false. After a frantic search through this unorganized pile, I finally found the card. It was partially torn, covered in mud, and heavily frayed. Inside were the still legible written words exactly as I remembered them, wishing me luck during my run. The next memory that followed was as clear as the card in front of me. I was sitting on the trail near a section of the course known as the Pillars of Doom, having just removed both of my shoes and socks. I recoiled at the horrific sight of my own feet, torn, battered, blistered, and macerated from the 4 loops of torture. I remember it was the first time in over 45 hours of unwavering commitment that I had come to accept that my race was likely over and that I was going to throw in the towel. I pulled out this exact card, read the words, and cursed myself for wanting to give up and knowing that it was very unlikely I would ever make it this far again. Somehow those words in front of me gave me a faint glimmer of hope and pulled me out of that deepest despair. Had I not had that card with me, I have no doubt I would have quit right there. The images and feelings of that memory were more vivid and poignant than any that had come back to me thus far, and it was only at that moment, standing in the corner of my small apartment by a heaping pile of filthy running supplies, that I truly remembered that it did all happen, and that I was in fact a Barkley finisher. Once I finally had this epiphany, I understood that my experience at the Barkley Marathons had been so monumentally overwhelming and traumatic that I did genuinely block large portions of it from my mind. And the fog was now finally starting to lift. As though floodgates had now been opened, countless memories came rushing back. I went back and watched posted video footage of my finish and started to remember the images and feelings as I approached that yellow gate. There was one memory that still eluded me, however. Upon seeing the vacant and soulless stare in my dead eyes immediately following my finish, I realized that I could still not recall any actual memories from those moments. This realization sent eerie chills down my spine, and it occurred to me that I may have experienced a very real sort of PTSD from my run that culminated with a complete dissociation and shutdown of my mind in those moments surrounding my finish. As compared to my various other ultra running endeavors at the time, I had the most difficulty returning to my normal way of life following the Barkley Marathons. Similar in many ways to my transition following my Pacific Crest Trail thru hike, I struggled to sit in my office chair and plug away at my graduate school research. It all just seemed so insignificant following the Barkley. It took me weeks for me to gradually catch up on my sleep and for most of the briar scratches to heal. The mental return to normalcy was even more profound, resulting in something of a monumental emotional crash and sense of depression. Paired with all of the emails I had also received, I found that I was still constantly asking myself if it really did all happen. Several weeks after returning home, things did slowly start to re-equilibrate. I was able to reflect on my experience more and realize just how privileged I was to have been a part of such an incredible event. Despite this, though, I still had so many questions about my run that I genuinely didn't know how to answer yet. Questions like, how was it that I never really got tired over 60 hours of nonstop running? Or how was I able to navigate so many sections of the course by myself so perfectly? Or how was it that fellow runners were able to patch up my feet so well that I could still run on them? And of course, how was it that I actually convinced myself to keep going after I had effectively quit at the end of loop 4? Again, so many times in those first few weeks following my run, I would catch myself asking, did I really finish the Barkley Marathons? Ultimately, it was one memory that eventually came back to me that helped me to finally accept the answer to this question. I remembered the exact moment that I was running down a series of switchbacks on the final descent of my fifth loop, just a mile from the finish and in the fading light of dusk, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Wake up, frozen head, I'm coming in." And that concludes the first part of my Barkley story. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll dig into some of the history of how I discovered this bizarre and grueling race, and just what sort of training I subjected myself to in order to adequately prepare for it. Until then, take care everyone, and be safe out there.